outside of just Cloud9 and CLG, another North American name who put in a good performance at the ESL ESEA Pro League finals was Moses on the analysis desk and doing casting as well as a color commentator. It's something he's kind of been ramping up in CSGO. But a lot of people may not know he actually has a playing background in Counter-Strike 1.6 going back to the early 2000s. So early 2000s, we're talking like late 2002. I think it was early 2003. His brother got him into a team called, his brother Hare, who would later on go on to be an in-game leader of one of some of his teams, got him into a Cal Invite team called Chikara. And Cal Invite was the top level of online play in North America. But if you were one of the bottom teams, as Chikara was, you weren't considered good. Like the gulf between you and the teams like Team 3D and Rival and... I guess Rival wasn't really there at that point in time. T3D, let me think, who would it be at the point? Domain of Pain, Riot Squad, these sorts of... There was a big gap still between it. Think of the ESEA Pro League now, where for the North American division, the bottom teams actually were quite far from the top. The top sort of 5 to 6 were competitive. Then once you get to the bottom, not really at all. So he played a couple of seasons in one of those teams, Chikara, and yeah, nothing to know. No one really paid attention to that team. They used to get beaten nearly all their games. But then him and his brother made a team which was called Valor. And they actually played with a guy called Nutshot, who used to be in a lineup with Jaden and DeBears called Elite Underground, which had shockingly made a top 12 of a CPL way back at the one where Nip and X3 made the final, CPL Winter 2001. So that was the main person who was known in this team, but then Moses and Hare became known a little bit. Now, in this point in time, 2003 we're talking here, they went to a CPL event, but they lost to some fairly uneventful teams, like Cal Invite level quality teams, but no one big, and they only made it like top 32. But then they were able to, then they decided to go serious, Moses and Hare's brother, and they make this team United 5, which was Moses and Hare, and Hare was the in-game leader. Then it was Fraud, who was the AWPer, who had previously been in teams like Green Berets. Then they had an Art of Execution. Then they had Trip, who I think had also been in Art of Execution, and then they had Slick, who I forget what teams he'd been in, but he was not really that well known. So this wasn't a team of really star players. Like Fraud had been done well online in past seasons of Cal, but he'd bombed his CPL at CPL Winter 2002. No one particularly thought he was a great player. So they put this team together, and the interesting thing is, Moses and his brother, first of all, being brothers, they had like a good synergy in game, and his brother Hare really went to work learning tactics and studying demos of the Europeans. And these guys used to look up to specifically Veslin's Team 9, because the thing about Team 9 was they were a team that actually like played very tactical Counter-Strike, and so they tried to bring some of that into U5. Whereas at the time, a lot of good American teams, even Team 3D to a degree, was still playing a very pug style. Like Team 3D had set struts, they had more of an approach, but because they had superstars, they still veered to some of the loose, open team superstar level style. Now U5, by implementing real strats and drilling them and coming up with new stuff and preparing things for specific opponents in online play, quickly got good actually. And in their first few Cal Invite seasons, they were making playoffs every time. They were beating 3D in the regular season. They made a run through, I think it was the semis of a Cal Invite. They didn't win any. I don't think they made a final. But they were a very legit team. They were showing themselves already to be a top-level team. And yet this wasn't with superstar players. Like, yes, Fraud was becoming a dominant AWPer, especially online. He was the best AWPer at the time, probably. But he hadn't had the big LAN result to kind of announce himself. And Moses was playing. He was pretty good at the time as well. He was one of the better players. Slick was like a middling player. Trip was more of a supportive player, and Hare was kind of around the middle. So it wasn't like they were packed with stars like a lot of the other teams they're playing against at the top level where they'd already gotten to. So instead, they were doing it with tactics and proper understanding of the game. Now, not only did they have the Cal Invite results, but then at the CPL Winter, and by the way, for anyone who doesn't know, CPL was like the big tournament at the time. It was the equivalent of the major. Like you had CPL, ESWC, WCG. These were the big majors. So this was the North American major. It would be two of them in the summer and the winter. So they go to the winter one for 2003. And a lot of people are still thinking, okay, they've done well online. But listen, teams like Rival had done well online. They've never done well at the big events. They've blown it at the LANs. So it wasn't necessarily a direct translation that if you did well in Cal Invite, that you'd do well offline as well. But actually at this tournament, they shocked the world, and they managed to finish the highest placing North American team at the event, which admittedly was only 7th overall. But along the way, they managed to beat Rival, which was... It wasn't admittedly the Rival later on that would go to the third place finishes. It had some slightly different players, but online they'd been a good team that year. They beat Team 3D. They upset Team 3D, the team that at the last CPL had finished in third place, and 2 CPLs before, a year before basically, had won the CPL. This was the lineup that at this point they just brought bombs in, so it had like Bomb, Steel, let me think, Moto, Bullseye, Rambo. These were the players in this team, so legendary names, some of the best in the history of North America, some of the most experienced as well in terms of top placings and number of lands played. This was a big upset. They beat them on Clan Mill, CPL Mill I guess it was called at the time. They beat G3X, Gex, who was the second best Brazilian team, but what's notable is at that tournament, that was when Kogu was actually on Gex, and he was showing himself already to be a very dangerous player, so that was a big win. Then they beat Four Kings, who had Zenon and were mainly UK players, and admittedly that Four Kings team at the time wasn't like elite material, but they were still a decent, solid, sort of like maybe like the 6th or 7th best European team, so this was a solid win to get one over them. And they lost to the team that would eventually go on to be called Eyeballers, 64 AMD, who was Hyper, Vilden, those guys, Archie, not the Fnatic one. And that team had been, at the time, the second best European team, actually, so it's understandable that they lost to them. So 7th place was a very reliable, a very kind of respectable finish, actually. Making top 8, if you were a North American team, was very respectable. Only someone like a 3D would be expected to really be able to have a chance to win and go far. So this was a big result, and this kind of announced them that, hey, this wasn't just an online phenomenon, this wasn't just Fraud going crazy online. Obviously, Fraud had a good tournament as well. This team's for real, this team's legit. Now, the problem is, they wouldn't even survive until the next CPL, which is in the summer, usually around early July or late July, just in July basically, because the problem was, as you'd see, as I described, this is going to be a repeating pattern in Moses' career. So, okay, the next event they do go to is already Moses is like getting a little bit more inactive. Like after that CPL, he basically he has like a girlfriend and he's spending more time with her, but he's still on the team. They're still playing. They're still going through the online seasons. Then they have the ESWC USA qualifier. So ESWC is another big major level event, and the USA qualifier was a LAN. And they go to this LAN, and actually the 2 favorites for this LAN, the 3 I guess, was Team 3D, obviously still a very well-known team. They had NOA, which was like Element, basically Norwegians and North Americans, and what they'd done is they'd used Destructo, a former rival player, to be able to have another American, to have I think like 3 or 5 North Americans is all you need to be able to compete in this qualifier. So I guess it was the North American qualifier, not USA qualifier, if I said that. And the other team was Rival. Let me think, was it Rival actually? I think U5, NOA. Oh, and 3D. Those are the 3 main teams that were expected to have a chance here. And there was only 2 spots for the ESWC tournament. So it was going to be between these 3 teams. Now, the problem here is that U5 ended up losing to NOA, which was understandable. NOA had like star players on their team. They were expected to get it together and be a good team. But the shock was that they lost to Rival. Now, the reason why that wasn't shock later on is because that Rival lineup basically went on to be the one that finished in those 3rd places at those the next 2 CPLs and became like a world-class level team and at one point in time the best North American team. So actually losing to them later on was respectable. And Fear had this crazy tournament, this Rival player. But at the time, this was kind of a shock also that they lost to them. Like they were still expected to be able to make it. So they finished in 4th place. Only top 2 made it anyway. At this point in time, Moses went fully inactive. He was too busy with his girlfriend. I mean, if you've ever seen the pictures of him, I tweeted some before. He was a very good-looking guy. He was in the prime of his life. He was in shape. He played CS for a couple of years. He'd had fun, but hey, listen, the team's gone as far as it can go. We're probably never going to become world champions. So, okay, he decided to kind of take a back seat. He was more interested in some other stuff, taking a breather. So he takes a breather. U5 changes players. They go about a different way. In fact, they actually went to a different approach where Hare made the team all move to Chicago, kicked a few players out, including Fraud, and they brought in different players from TSG, and they made this home team there. Now, Moses does eventually come back into, after a few months, he gets back into playing again. He joins Tech, often nicknamed the Elite Clan, but no one ever actually really knows what the name was because they never revealed it. And in Tech, this lineup they had was Moses, Elude, who was a young, skilled player, kind of nothing of his day, except he never really did it on LAN. They had Gosu, who was a young, skilled player. Jaden, who was like an old school player, but had certain problems on LAN sometimes. Tool, who was like a decent player, had been around a number of these Calinvat level teams. And Guki was the brother of Elude, and he was kind of the in-game leader, but he wasn't that skilled, he was just average. Actually, he was probably bad, if I'm being honest. So he joins this team. It was around like September of that year, I think. So he'd had like the summer off, spend time with his girlfriend. And then online play, they're doing all right. But they come to the CPL Winter 2004. And Here's the thing. They end up only making top 24. They finished 17th to 24th. But there are some caveats to that. Like in the first match that they play in the upper bracket, they play Begrip. And this Begrip team was the one that had Khan, it had DSN, it had Iskal. This lineup ended up going to something like, I think they finished 4th at that CPL. So in the end, they would actually do very well. This is actually kind of unfortunate to get paired with them so early on. And they only lose this first game. I think it was like 14-16 or something. It was very close. And it was an Inferno game. And the reason why I vividly remember it is because despite losing the game, actually Moses had one of the famous CPL highlights of this era that was featured in a lot of frag movies. In fact, I think it's in the movie Clutch, that famous frag movie, if you've ever watched it, where he wins a 1v4 against Big Rip in the A site on Inferno. It's quite sick, actually. It's pretty awesome. He takes them on one by one. Then the last two, he just kills with 2 headshots. I think Khan and DSN actually might have been the last two. He wins a sick 1v4. They would go on to beat the SK Germany side, not the one with Heaton and all those guys who weren't that good. They were like a mid-level European team. Beat them in the lower bracket, but then they had to play Big Rip again in the lower bracket round 2, which again you're thinking, well, how can that be if that team finishes top 4? Well, unfortunately, because that Big Rip team had gotten upset by Death is Eternal, this North American West Coast pug type team. And so they dropped to low bracket, and then they knock Moses' tech team out there. So sad thing is, they were actually a bit hard done by here. We never really got to see how good they could have been, because their 2 losses were to a team that ended up finishing 4th. Now, I will say, unfortunately, being in tech almost ensured Moses wasn't going to get any good LAN results, because unlike United 5, this is a team that didn't use any strats. And unfortunately, online, Moses and Jaden were always really good online. Elude and Jaden were always really good online. In fact, Elude was phenomenal online. He was like a nothing. He used to just tear it up against North Americans online. His problem was, it wasn't even LANs. Like, he would have good LANs. It's just CPL events, those big pressure CPLs. Aside from his first, back in 2002 winter, all the other ones, Tech had famously bombed and never made they never made top 16. And part of the reason why is, unfortunately, their star player, Elude, never was able to play like a monster like he did online. And so when you're in a team with him and then Jaden, yeah, had one tournament that was decent. Actually, the same one, CPL win in 2002 with Riot Squad. But he'd famously been a part of a number of teams, including an early Team 3D in 2002 summer, who bombed out in I think it was 17th place again. So these teams weren't placing very well at all. Unfortunately, despite having players who online were very good. So when you play with 2 of those players who have a tendency to choke, yeah, you can see where you're going to have issues. With that said, there were some caveats to this one. This wasn't quite the same as the other Tech chokes. But as a result, no one was really surprised when Tech didn't make top 16 again. Now, during his era in Tech, there was another clip that was in a frag movie. I think it was in Around the World, which was where he had like a 5 kill, an ace against Rival on Dust 2. This was the good Rival as well. This was online play. Just another clip that people might remember him by. And again, you'll see in both these clips. I'm pretty sure he's on Terra's side in both clips. So he's using the AK. Yeah, he was a skilled player at the time. After that, he joins up in early 2005 with United 5. And at this point, though, his Moses, Hare, his brother, has left the team. His brother actually now goes inactive. And along comes Moses. He joins up with his team. Even though it was called United 5, they only really went under the United 5 organization where his brother was. In reality, United 5 was the Die team that had finished, I think they finished, was it 7th? I think they finished 7th at that previous CPL, the one that he was at with Tech. I think they finished in 7th place. They'd beat 3D in the deciding game there. So it was like Patio, John, Habibi, K-Mode, and Keen. Actually, Habibi had been in Weekend Warriors, but the others were all from... And in fact, yeah, Keen was actually in the other one. So I think this was mainly the Die players from now. So they'd been a decent team before. So people think, okay, he joins up with them. Maybe they'll get in the mix. Maybe he can be good. Unfortunately, he went inactive almost immediately and never went to any of the lands. Never went to CPL Brazil. Never went to the CPL Summer. Never went to any of them because this time, because of school, that was the reason we were inactive now. So you can see, unfortunately, real life was always pulling him away a little bit. Now that was pretty much it in terms of his 1.6 career. So to speak on his skills as a 1.6 player, he was a strong aimer. He had good technique, like he fired the weapons correctly. He wasn't just like a full auto spray player. He had some tapping, he had a little bit of bursting. He wasn't just spamming away. He wasn't some monster aimer, but he was a good player. Like you could tell he'd practiced a lot, and when he had his rhythm going, he wasn't inactive, that he'd actually gotten his skills up to a good level. And he knew how to play a role within a lineup, which was key because you're obviously playing alongside your brother. If your brother's the in-game leader and you can play the skilled role properly and execute, you're going to allow your brother's tactics to be able to work in the game. Now, what's more important is that since they both had kind of idolized Vessel as Team 9, who were the team who played like the right way, the very tactical approach with executes and reading the opponent and trying to anti-strat them, the key thing was, at the time, okay, when Team 9 was on top at their best, that's also when SK rose up to become the dominant team. And then SK played more of a loose style because they had all the superstars. They had Spawn, they had Element, they had Heat, and they had Potty. So they had the aimers, whereas by learning so a lot of NA teams tried to copy them. That's what 3D did, just overstack your teams with all-star players. Instead, United 5 went the right approach with less skill especially, of trying to make it tactical, trying to make it team play based, and trying to get tactics that fit you, and steal tactics from other people as well. If a Team 3D come up with something interesting, steal that. If the Titans at ESWC that year come up with something, steal that. That's what this team was able to do, So he was good at decent player tactically in terms of his role. And also, he was a good clutch player. As I mentioned, he had this famous 1v4 round against Big Grip, but he was known to be a player under pressure who actually played pretty well. And like I said, even in the tech team that failed, that CPL, he did pretty reasonably well, actually. In terms of his career, there's a few patterns which kind of decided and defined the way his career went, and maybe held him back from other things, but also were part of the reason for his success. So first of all, having his brother was key, because his brother got him onto Chikara in the first place, then took him into U5, and then was probably, I think, responsible for getting him into the later U5, which was the team that he was managing or whatever, or was the CEO of. So that helped, and obviously working with someone that you know as well as that, it's going to give you a chance, especially when you're trying to be tactical, of looking good and being able to play a good role. So that's all good. The problem is, first and foremost, that meant that early on he was going to stick with them. And at this time, after good CPLs or bad CPLs, there would always be these huge roster shakeups. But you got the sense that initially he wasn't going to leave his brother and go off and play with someone else. He was happy to stick there. So he wasn't really viewed early on as being someone on the market to be picked up by better teams or whatever. I mean, at the time there wasn't better teams at that CPL, but later on there would be. A big problem, as I've mentioned a number of times now, is going inactive for reasons that are circumstantial outside of the game. Extracurricular activities, as it were. So girls, school. Now, like I said, it's understandable in terms of where he was in his life. But if he hadn't have had these issues, if he'd just stayed super dedicated, especially since the teams had changed and his brother tried that team on LAN that stayed in Chicago, and then later on with the other U5, I could have seen actually him having a lot more success and being a much better player, because he was a good player, was a top player at the time. The problem is, first of all, from being on U5, when U5 upset 3D at that CPL, because they had Fraud, and because certain people didn't like Hair because he was quite brash and quite cocky and quite confident in his attitude, people like 3D used to hate it when people upset them like that. They used to think that they were all bullshit and that they just got lucky. And so it meant that someone like Moses, who was quite a nice guy actually, got mixed in with those and was unfortunately tarred as being like, oh, he's part of that team. So I don't think he was ever really a candidate for teams like 3D to recruit him in that sense. Also at the time, if 3D doesn't recruit him, okay, who else is good at the time? Well, Rival becomes really good, but Rival's an all West Coast team, so it's probably not going to be joining that, because like I said, I mean, he comes from the East Coast to a degree. I guess it's more like to the east, to the middle area. It's hard to describe America, but it's around Chicago, Illinois, this sort of area. The other good teams were, there was Complexity, which had Fraud in those guys, but they were kind of leftovers, and then because they had their own success out of nowhere, they just stuck with that lineup, and they were under Jason Lake, and they didn't have big sponsors. And then who else was even available? I guess there was the Die team, which eventually he went on to join. So you can see there wasn't a whole lot of options as to where he could go in terms of better teams. I did always think he should have been a 3D type prospect, though, because he had a good head on him. He wasn't a super cocky guy, but he was confident. He had good skills. He was good under pressure. But first of all, you play with tech and fail on land. That's not going to help you. You played with a team that upset you once at one CPL, and then Team 3D doesn't respect you because after that, the team doesn't do much. You go inactive. You're not going to be top of people's list, unfortunately, to get recruited. But at a time when Team 3D was ramming their land with too much skill and they didn't have good team play and they couldn't execute all that well, and then players would have off CPLs, I think he could have been a good player to help them actually. He could have been like poor man's Volcano to a degree. He wouldn't have been as good as Volcano, because Volcano hit a very high peak at his probably like late 2004, but he could have been like a poor man's version. He could have been a very good solid player to put in the mix there instead of recruiting someone like Dominator at the time. So I think a bit of bad timing and just circumstances of where he was in the scene at his best points is what meant that Moses didn't have more of a career and didn't become one of the great North American players. Now in CSGO, he was around briefly. He was around like 2013. He was in the United 5 actually, the Complexity actually, which had XP3, who obviously is now in Elevate, but had been a famous French player from like 2006. He'd made top 4 at CPL. I think it was 4th he made it with AAA against All 30. And then he'd come over to North America. He'd played with teams there at the end of 1.6. So he's in a team with XP3. And then Storm and Warden had both been call players before. And so, as in during their success back in 2005, 2006 in 1.6. And they go to ESEA Season 15, which was the one where iBuyPower first upset Titan in the final and won the tournament shockingly. And actually, they finished 4th place here. So it went iBuyPower, Titan, who was the best team in the world at the time, Complexity, and then 4th place was this Complexity team that Moses was in. And he actually had a decent tournament, actually. Had decent numbers, he fragged decently. The team wasn't that great, though. They were just okay. Then they went to the Iron Gaming LAN the next year, which was the one, I think that was the one that was won by NIP, and then in the final they beat Na'Vi. And so in the semi-finals, this team made it that far. They might have had a different name then, but Moses was on the team that made it to the semis, but obviously they lost there. Beyond that, that was pretty much it for his career. Like, yeah, he was playing in ESEA invite, but he was never going to be in a top team, unfortunately. And also, I don't know if he was dedicating the time to do it. So beyond that, he becomes a commentator for ESEA lands, and I don't know if in part because of ESEA's association with the league, but for ESL, ESEA Pro League Finals, this one now, they invited him and he was the analyst and he was a colour commentator. Did a very good job, actually. And one of the key things I think about him as a commentator and analyst that makes him very good is a lot of the North Americans, especially the commentators, because the games they're commentating and the leagues they're going to get the jobs for, most likely are the North American leagues and North American lands, and it's just the world they're immersed in. They are spending most of their time playing pugs with these players, talking to the North American players, watching the North American players play, watching as much of North American Counter-Strike as they can, and some of them watch some of the European lands and watch some, but actually I've noticed that actually Moses seemed to put a lot more effort into watching the Europeans than a lot of the North Americans that I've seen, especially if they hadn't cast a league. He was watching these things, he was in it, he was a fan of it, he would watch the best teams, he would watch TSM, he'd watch Na'Vi, he'd watch NIP, he'd watch Fnatic, he'd watch Envious. He's watching them, trying to learn, trying to see what they do differently. Also, this comes from his past, where they'd done that when he'd been in this United 5 team with his brother here, and then after that period when he'd got inactive, he'd worked for ESEA actually as a writer, and he'd done some articles about European teams, about big CPL events. So I think he's always been a fan in that sense, and he's always, as I said, enjoying Team 9 before, enjoyed the tactical approach as well as just the skills and watching the matches. That's why I think he has a good mind also for breaking down what should a team do differently here in terms of stylistic approach. I don't know that specific tactics he's that amazing at. I don't know if he has that kind of a mind for that. He seems to have some of it, but his speciality to me is more like the style approach. Like, should they speed the tempo up here? Should they be slowing it down and saving more in these situations? He has a really good eye for that sort of thing. And obviously he knows the North American players as well, whereas a lot of the Europeans, we don't have such a good insight on some of the North Americans because they weren't as relevant until recently. So I think he's a very ideal character rather to be on these analysis desks and to be doing casting. So I hope we see him at more international events. Always was a fan of him as a player. He was a good player. Always had a good attitude. And yeah, that's who Moses is. So this podcast is sponsored by Alpha Draft, where you can play fantasy esports such as Counter-Strike Global Offensive. And they had ESL, ESEA Pro League when it was the online portion. They had DreamHack Summer. So you can go there, play, possibly win money by picking the right team, you get a salary and you pick out the players you want from the play day. You try to put together the team you think will score the most points. I always get wrecked by picking like Kenny S and stuff, and then sometimes they let me down there, but it's actually quite fun.